Bienvenida a esta entrevista.
Welcome to this interview to two great ladies of science fiction, Rambo and Leckie. Both give an optimistic and also feminist message about the future of humanity. We will see that there are some similarities in both professional careers. So, first of all, thanks for being here in the Festival 42 in Barcelona. From Rambo, just because she's closer to me, and Leckie um, is next to her. But we could highlight in Cat Rambo a lot of short stories, and also she's been a co-editor of Fantasy magazine, apart from being serving a president for 4 years of this SFWA. And later we will refer to this Writers of America. We have published in Spanish, The Secret Mechanics of the World, published by the La Máquina Secreta, que hace Ping. Leckie arrived with Ancillary Justice in Spanish, and she had all the prizes. I cannot start counting all the prizes, and this is not the interest of this interview. We would prefer to listen to them. So I would like also to talk about the Gigantamasaurus, where she worked as editor. This is an online magazine. You see here on the table Ancillary Justice and also the full trilogy of the Imperial Grudge. Okay, this will be just the introduction. And now I'll start with the questions. You both write science fiction and fantasy, but do you have some preference for one one or the other genre? Because there's actually quite difficult to write both. I don't know what's more difficult. Do you think that it requires a special effort to change from both genres?
To write science fiction is harder in terms of getting the science right. To write fantasy is harder in terms of getting the matters of the soul right.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I feel like maybe they didn't begin as the same, but after many years of authors writing both, authors mixed them up and put them together in different ways, and so they've become very similar. But science fiction is more about the technology and the science, although you can also do technology and science in fantasy. Fantasy does give you a little extra room for just making up fun things, whether they would really work in the real world or not. But I tend to view them both as very similar, and so one is not harder than the other. They just have slightly different things that make them easier or harder.
We were talking earlier about a teacher of Anne's student telling them that a book was not science fiction, it was speculative fiction, which is in many ways exactly the same thing.
Yes, and the teacher even said, well, speculative fiction is, and gave a definition of science fiction, and said, and that's different from science fiction. I was very surprised. I didn't even know what to say.
Yeah.
And my student said, please don't be angry with my teacher. I knew you would be angry.
Bueno, dentro de la ciencia ficción y la fantasía, y en otros géneros también.
In science fiction and fantasy, there's a duality between short stories and novels. You've written both genres in Spanish. What we have from Cat Rambo are short stories of the secret mechanics of the world. And in Anne, for not a long time ago, The Long Game has come out. And also Far Reaches, which is only in Amazon. Julio Cortázar in the battle between a short story and a novel. The novel wins by points, but the short stories have to win by KO. Do you agree with this definition? And you said that science fiction and fantasy, it's not that. It's because you both master both genres. But do you think that when you write differently when you are approaching a short story or a novel?
Very differently. A novel has room to breathe. You can stretch out and relax. You can put so much in and just bring in all the beautiful things. With a short story, you've only got a certain amount of space. It's like a very tiny room, and you can't put all the things in it because they won't fit, so you have to be very careful about what things do go in. If you put in the wrong things, the story won't have the effect you want. So it's a much more careful thing, but it's not easier or harder. Once again, it's just different. Because for the novel, you can throw everything in, but if you throw too much of the wrong things in, the novel goes awry, it goes astray and doesn't work. But you have to be much more efficient with a short story.
Yeah, a novel can be about many things, and a story has a hard time being about more than one kind of emotional heart. And when I'm writing a story, one of the things I need to figure out is what is that one thing that guides the story.
Vuestras dos últimas novelas se pueden catalogar ambas.
Okay, sorry.
Perdón, esto son cosas del directo. Y si no la podemos.
This is something that live interviews. So we need to take our time and listen to them carefully. So in both, maybe you can elaborate a bit of your latest works, but do you think that both are like space operas?
I know mine is space opera for sure, but Anne is the one who inspired the series originally. And that is why the first book is dedicated to her.
Yes, I believe I definitely write space opera, partly because space opera is the kind of science fiction where you should pay attention to the science, but there's room to just make something beautiful that maybe isn't scientific. Make it big, make it colorful, make it high-pitched, make it wonderful, fun, yeah, and maybe not always pay attention to the science. Science is important, and I love a good hard science fiction, but there's something so beautiful about the giant spaceships and big space battles and planets and stars of space opera, yeah.
Lo siento, pero ahora ya me voy a saltar el guión porque...
I'm sorry, because I need to know why Leckie was an inspiration for you, Kat, because now I want to know it.
I run an online school, and Anne very kindly agreed to do a class on space opera, which she's going to do again next year. And in the middle of the class, she said sort of wistfully, "Oh, I wish someone would write a space opera from an omniscient point of view." And I said, "Challenge accepted."
¿Qué te crees? ¿Que no voy a...?
Like, do you think I'm not gonna be able? Okay, it will take a challenge. Understood, thanks. Do you think that the genre of space opera has future, or is depleted? Because after the British space opera, not that many works have come out that can maybe fit within the pure, genuine space opera, and it's more mingled with other genres.
One of the things about science fiction is, while it is ostensibly about the future, it is about our times. And I feel that space opera is in many ways a hopeful genre, and I feel that right now we need hope more than ever. So yes, absolutely space opera.
Yes, also I would remind folks that space opera had a big heyday back in like the 30s and the 40s, And in the 60s, everybody was like, oh, this is played out, this is old, there will never be anything good in space opera. And then, of course, it comes back. Star Wars comes back, which is space opera, right? And all of a sudden, space opera. Then it kind of goes down. Then we have the British new space opera. And then it was like, oh, it's out of style. And I'm like, it's like skirts, right? The long skirts are fashionable, the hemline moves up, the mini skirts are fashionable. Everybody goes, oh, thank goodness, not mini skirts, because my legs can't do that. And then, but then in another 10 years, it's going to be mini skirts again, right? It's fashion. It goes around and around and around, and things go away and come back and go away and come back. So I think there's always room for space opera to come back.
They used to come from Cat is the second part of a trilogy starting with You Sexy Thing. This is such a cool name, right? Do you think like a little bit of the plot of the sexy thing and also for the last book, maybe just to have a rough idea?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Is it?
Same.
There is a group of retired soldiers, and they have created a restaurant aboard a space station. It's going wonderfully. They're in fact about to have a restaurant critic come and give them a coveted Nicolin orb. And then a mysterious package arrives, things start exploding, and they are forced to steal an intelligent spaceship that is not convinced it wishes to be stolen.
It's great fun.
This really, really draws my attention. And Anne, about your last book, Translation State, can you give us a summary?
Translation State is set in the Imperial Raj universe, just like Justicia Auxiliar. So in the trilogy, there is the aliens, the Presker, and the Presker translators show up. And so Translation State, one of the characters is a young Presker translator, so we get to see what those people are like. Another person is someone who has a job of tracking down a diplomat from the Presker who has gone missing. And the third character is someone who is adopted into a very loving family, but really is trying to find out who he is and why he seems so different from everyone else around him. And those three characters get together, and of course things blow up, and yeah.
Yes, everything blows up. For one reason or another, everything blows up. In your arts, there's some humorism, there's some sense of humor in The Devil's Gun. We will talk about this omniscient character that tells a story, and that is really a figure of itself. And in Translation State, there's also this sense of humor, maybe secondary, from a secondary point of view, because there's also this lack of understanding between the different spaces, no? This is actually the title, what the title refers to. Is it easy for you to introduce humor? It's just natural for you because it flows, or it's a bit more tricky to introduce it in your work?
I started writing the first book because I wanted to write the kind of book I love to read. And so it becomes easy to write humor if you love humor and read a lot of it. So yeah, I think I find it easy, but I let the characters talk and they say funny things, and that amuses me.
Yes, I agree. I also think that even when something is very, very serious, I mean, in real life, right, when things are going very badly and things are very serious, oftentimes we make a joke, right? What do they say? The saying is, you know, we laugh because otherwise we would cry.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like humor has always got a place. And when I'm writing, sometimes I come along, I say, oh, that would be funny. I guess I'll put that in. And if my editor doesn't like it, then I can take it out.
Las space opera que han...
Space operas written by the two writers are not only a relief of humor and adventures, they are also very deep-grounded thoughts and reflections about what being human means. In Cat Rambo, there's clone characters. I don't want to give too much information to avoid spoilers. And there's also the Kvem. I am sorry if I mispronounce it, and it's a particular way to approach the world because it has also some special features that can be read in the book. So the fact, speaking about what humankind and humanity is, so using sci-fi as a perfect tool to discuss such philosophical topics of reality, humanity, and the different possibilities, you think that's a good way to do that?
Why would I say it was a bad way to do it? No, I think it is. I think it lets you talk about the fact that humans are so very different. And it lets you talk about the fact that despite the fact that we are so very different, some of the time we manage to get along and maybe even do more than get along, but get along wonderfully.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that science fiction and fantasy as well, because you make a new world that isn't like our world, we can look at problems or questions in our world from an angle that you wouldn't see standing where we are, right? It lets you stand in a different place and see it from a different direction. And it's a really good way of asking, like, who is human? Who do we consider human? Who are the people who maybe we don't consider as human as we should? What does that mean? And it's easier to ask that question from a distance sometimes, because if you ask too close up, you can, trigger some defensiveness or not be able to see it from the right angle. And I think science fiction and fantasy is a really good tool for doing that.
Kat said before that the idea was to have an omniscient narrator, to be able to see everything. This is the feeling spaceship, which is called You Sexy Thing. And this is the not the collective awareness, but the distributed awareness that is also Justice of Turin, also connected to Anne Leckie's work. So you're giving awareness. Do you think about different ways to give awareness to a spaceship?
I modeled the spaceship on my cat. And he was not the smartest cat in the world, but he was a funny, wonderful, loving cat. And so when I'm thinking about the spaceship, I do think about Raven. So yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking in a lot of ways about the ways that our minds see the things around us, how our brains basically control how we perceive the world. And so that was a big part of what I was thinking about when I made the ancillaries and when I made the ships, and the ways that emotion comes into thinking, and the way that that was really important to the way I put the ships together. Yeah.
Como he dicho antes.
As I said before, The Devil's Gun is the second work of a trilogy, and actually, very often the second book of a series has this fear of, oh, this is the second part. This is the syndrome of the second book, because in the first I give all the new information. This is really captivating. And then the second book, what happens? And what happens with the third book? So like, okay, what should I do? Do I have to give everything to the third book? What happens with the second book? Maybe how can you phrase the second book?
It is a really difficult thing to think about, because you want, in theory, for someone who has not read the first book to be able to pick up the second book. I cheat by including a synopsis at the beginning. And actually, I plan to have 10 books in this series, but the publisher doesn't know that yet.
I think they know that now.
So yeah.
Yeah, I find that a trilogy is one whole story. And so the first book is just the introduction. It's just the, like if it were a single novel, like many novels, George Eliot, I don't know about Spanish literature as much, but in English, many novels from the 1890s were actually published as trilogies, and we read them as one volume, like one long story. And so the second book is just the middle of the story. But that can be, you're right, that can be a problem because it's not as exciting and new as the first volume, and it's really just the middle of the action of the big story, and you have to wrap everything up in the third book. So really, the only way to do it is the way you write any novel, which is just one word at a time, and you pretend you're not afraid of messing it up.
Pues la verdad.
I imagine that it was not cheating having a synopsis there, but that make me think of another question, because you have also magics in your space opera. So is science fiction with magics, or you would call it another way?
Technically, I believe it is space fantasy. But we like to come up with words for things, so...
Yeah, when someone says it doesn't fit, you say, well, actually, it's this thing here that I've invented. Although space fantasy's been around for a while, but that's very convenient, right? And you say, oh, no, it's this.
Well, I used to edit fantasy magazine, and people would come and say, will you ever take science fiction? I was like, no, but I will take space fantasy.
Yeah.
Sí, la verdad es que nos gusta la etiqueta.
We like labels really more than anything. Translation state in this case is the coming back of the imperial rot, but it was a long time from the first novel. So you thought that you had to strike a balance between those that have read the trilogy, so that they still have some kind interest, but also something that can be a door to get into your opera, to your work with translation state, just for both types of readers. And as far as I understand, you can read it as a standalone. How do you strike the balance between mentioning what has happened before, but that doesn't require having read the three first books to enjoy them as a novel in itself?
It's a tough balance, actually. I have to remember that I want to summarize some things for people who have not read the trilogy and know what's going on, but at the same time, I don't want to make the people who have read the trilogy bored. And so I just have to kind of try and make it work, right? I wanted Translation State to be very much a standalone, but I also wanted to make sure there were things that I hoped readers of the trilogy would see and go, oh, it's so wonderful to see that. That reminds me of the other, a character in another book, or I'm so glad to see that character. But hopefully new people being introduced to them wouldn't be like, who the heck is that? Because they have an important part in the plot, and it just makes sense that they're there. But it is difficult. It's a thing you really have to think about when you're writing.
Well, I think this is true whenever you're doing, particularly like retellings of fairy tales or cultural legends, and you have to create something which someone innocent of that narrative, someone who doesn't know that narrative at all, will still enjoy, but that the person who does know the narrative will get these little flickers of delight, the Easter eggs, just because someone that read your other books that reads Translation State is going to hit moments and go, ooh, right?
Yeah. I hope so. I hope so. I try to do that. Yeah.
In this novel, Translation State, it says it's the same name. It's very important, the role of the interpreter. And it just takes the words or the speech of a character or species of human towards other intelligent beings that don't speak the same language, and with different morphology, maybe. And it's like bridging two cultures, and the same happens when your work is being translated in other languages. I guess not only in Spanish, in other languages as well. Are you in touch with your translators? Because I know that Kat Rambo's translator has been talking to her, yeah, just to clarify some passages. But do you think, are you involved in the translation process? Are you in touch with the translator to just answer some doubts or clarify some aspects? Or is something that it's out of our control and you just believe what is being translated? But maybe you know some English, but we're not all multi-language speakers.
I speak enough Spanish that I love having things translated into Spanish because then I can read it and pretend that I understand beautifully. But most of, and with this book, I did get a chance for the translator to ask me questions and say, because you may be aware, English has some weird expressions in it here and there. But a lot of the time, we don't get a chance to check the words. And in some ways, we're at the mercy of the translators. And that, to be a translator, is a very important, difficult job that I think is as difficult as the writing, because they want to translate it in a way that lets the voice of the book come through. It's very hard to do.
Yeah, it's really, really hard. Because translating, a lot of times people who only know one language think that translating is just changing the word in English to the word in Spanish. But it's not that simple, right? They're very different. And some languages are even more different than English is different from Spanish. I haven't had conversations with my Spanish translators. Sometimes, many of my translations, I don't know who translated it. But I know, for instance, my French translator had a difficulty because, unlike English, French, like Spanish, has gendered nouns. And that is strange for writing in English. It's not something I planned for. And Breck, who always speaks about other people as she, and who is she to other people throughout the book, is a ship, but the word for ship in French is masculine, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And the translator had to find some way to deal with that. And I think he found a very clever way. I won't go into it. I was really, really pleased with the way the translator dealt with that. In some languages, verbs are gendered, and there's only a choice of masculine or feminine. And so where I'm playing with not calling out someone's gender, or when, in English I can just not say it, you can't do that in those languages. If you say I sat, it has to be I feminine sat. And that's a difficulty for a book that's playing with how English handles gendered words, right? And so those translators have had to come up with some way to handle that. And it's always been fascinating to talk about that. For languages that I know nothing about. I know a very tiny bit of Spanish. I know a very tiny bit of German, and that's about it. And so it's always really exciting to talk to the translators when I get a chance to.
What was more famous or had more repercussion in ancillary justice was the terminology. Everything was with she, and it had also a repercussion and controversy. Do you think that after that moment, or maybe before, there's been a new feminist trend in science fiction and fantasy, or maybe it was something that was there before, but it didn't have such a large repercussion? What's your opinion? Do you think that this feminist trend in science fiction is out there? It's been always there, now it has a climax, or what?
So I think women have always written and read science fiction from the very beginning. I think there's a thing that happens where people look around in whatever decade it is and say, wow, where did all these girls come from? Isn't this a new exciting thing? And wow, it's wonderful. And then a few years go by and they go, oh, girls don't read science fiction. Yeah. And then they go, oh, look at all these women reading science fiction. Isn't that a new thing? Just over and over again. I grew up in the 70s. I went to the library every weekend, and the shelves were full of books written by women science fiction writers, many of them very outspokenly feminist. And the works were very feminist. And I thought, ooh, science fiction, it's a great place for girls to be. 10 years later, everybody, oh, science fiction is a boys' club, and no women have written science fiction, why none that were important? And I'm like, I was just there in the 70s, the bookshelves were full of it. Yeah. And so my book comes out, and everybody's like, oh, look at all these women writing science fiction, isn't that new? And I'm like, has everyone forgotten? Apparently everyone has forgotten. So I think it's always been there. I do think that the controversy around the use of she for everyone in the book did help. It's not what the book's about. It's not the important part of the book, but it caught enough people to talk about it that it led to the book being more famous than maybe it would have been otherwise.
And didn't your editor push back and you had to push for that?
No, my editor did not push back. I was very surprised. I actually, while I was working on the novel, I had a friend who's a professional science fiction writer, and she read it and she said, wow, I really love this. You will never sell it. And I said, I know, you're right. But part of being a writer is you have to just go ahead and do what you want to do no matter what. You have to be very determined. And I said, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so I sent it out. And when I was talking to the person who's my agent now, it was before he made an offer to represent my work, he said, I'm not sure about this use of the pronouns, this use of she. And I thought, oh, this is it. I'm going to ruin my career if I stick to this. But I've decided to stick to it. So I wrote this 3,000-word-long email explaining why I had to keep the use of she and sent it off. And I was like, that's it. That's the end of my career. And about a half an hour later, I get an answer back from my for who's now my agent saying, okay. That was pretty much all the pushback I got. Okay. So the editor who purchased it for Orbit sat down to talk to me about the first chapter and how to edit. He said, when I first read it, I said, well, we're going to have to do something about this first chapter and using she. And then he said, and then I went back to read it again, and I was like, no, actually, it's fine. It fixed itself. Well, what actually happened was he learned how to read it, right? He read it the first time, it seemed weird. He read it the second time. Since it was already familiar, he saw what it was doing. And I expected much more pushback, and I didn't get it. I feel like that's an important lesson because a lot of times, and it's true, a lot of times folks who are marginalized, women, people of color, people of other marginalized genders, there is a lot of discrimination out there, and it is harder to get published. But at the same time, sometimes if you try, it works out okay. Yeah. So when you tell yourself, it's all stacked against me, okay, it's stacked against you. But that's not a reason to give up. That's a reason to keep trying. If you can. It can be exhausting. But I think that was a really important lesson for me.
Well, and I think before that time, there had been a lot of pushback against the idea of using non-gendered language. And writers would say things like, well, how can you use they for a person? It's too confusing. And now we have non-binary people, and it's absolutely possible to do this. But I really do feel like you helped set the stage for that.
I hope so. That's my grandiose fantasy, is maybe I helped a little bit, because it's really incredible, the things that are coming out. And I want to have helped with that, right? I can't take credit for it, because the credit is due to the amazing writers who are publishing these things, who are writing them and sending them out. They're the folks who are doing it. But I hope that I could help a little bit.
¿Nos podéis poner algunos ejemplos de esta?
Can you give an example of these works that are being published right now, which would follow this wave, or people who have created their works with your help in a certain way?
I would be bragging, but I would... the first things that comes to mind actually is Murderbot.
Yeah.
But there are many others. I know Becky Chambers came out about the time my book came out, but she's also been a person, I think, who's helped people. Many space operas by interesting people. What was the one? This is terrible. I read it. It was so good. About the violinist and the alien.
Rika Aoki. Rika Aoki.
Rika Aoki, maybe?
Donuts. It can be that, I don't remember.
I don't remember. I've seen a bunch. Yeah, yes, the Uncommon Stars or something like that. Yeah, that's.
¿no? Las estrellas poco corrientes, uncommon stars. I would say, I don't know. Hay muchas.
I feel uncomfortable trying to take credit for some of the amazing stuff that's come out recently, and there's been so much.
But you're not taking credit.
I know, but
you're not stealing their credit.
I know, but I'm the sort of person, I do an interview and someone says, what books have you read recently that you really like? And I have a lot of books that I've read recently that I really like, and they all just fall right out of my brain. And that's what's happening to me right now, and I apologize.
Bueno, cuando ejercisteis vuestra labor.
Well, when you did your task as a publisher in several magazines, maybe you had an influence, you influenced on this with the selection of the stories that you were publishing. Which editorial line did you follow to when it came to choose which stories you wanted to publish? How was the selection like?
What I would do is I would let a lot of stories pile up, and then I would sit down in an evening and I would read furiously. And I would put the ones that I liked in a folder, and then I would go away and I would come back 3 days later, and any story where I could not look at the file name and say instantly, oh yeah, it was that story, that went away. And so that was my first criteria, because as an editor, I wanted the kind of stories that would make, long after people had read them, to be in their kitchens cooking and suddenly be like, oh yeah. You know, that's what you want as an editor, because you love stories and you want people to find the good stories. It's the best job in the world, because you get to eat the candy and give it to other people.
That's very true, yeah. I did similarly. I didn't have like a set of guidelines for myself. What kind of story am I looking for? I would just look at the slush pile and say, what do I like? What delights me, right? Is there a story? Do I really enjoy this story? And if I start reading and I'm getting bored or like, no, that's not the story. If I start reading and I don't even remember I'm reading anymore, I'm just going, oh, wow, this is great. That would be the story. It almost didn't matter what the story was about. Supposedly, I was taking fantasy and science fiction, but I would take something that I had to make an excuse to pretend it was fantasy or science fiction. It was my magazine. I mean, I could publish anything I wanted, right? So I was just publishing the stories that I liked.
I had to justify it to the publisher.
Yeah, you didn't own it. Yeah, I owned my magazine, so.
Bueno,
Well, we mentioned in the introduction that you also played a huge role in the Science Fiction and Writers of America as a president and as a secretary, and you as a president, even though you didn't coincide during your mandate. From this point of view, from the management of a corporate organism, I don't know if I can mention it that way, but from this command position, what did you think about feminism in science fiction? Have you collaborated in the fight for rights? I mean, to publish works from black people, or I guess you played an important role, but can you tell us more about it, please?
The Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, I was very lucky in that I got to oversee a very important change, which is that they started bringing in independently published people who were publishing their own work and making a living off it. And I found that very important, because that was where the working writers were. That was where the people who were writing for a living, as opposed to some people who were writing and being a little snobby about it. I feel that science fiction in recent years, in the last, has learned that it needs to be listening to a lot of voices, that it needs to be listening to the voices of writers of color, writers who aren't the top 1%, writers who are non-binary or alternate genders. I mean, it's so important to have a multitude of voices because people have to be able to see themselves in your fiction. And I was talking to Anne earlier, and I said I've sat next to Mercedes Lackey, I've sat next to Shannon Maguire, and people come up and they have tears in their eyes, and they are so happy to be meeting this person who was the first person to show themselves in fiction. Everybody should get to see themselves in fiction. I think that is an almost sacred thing.
Yeah, absolutely. My year, we were sort of building up to the letting in the indie, the self-published folks, who, some of them are folks who could not get published with the big houses, and some of that may be because they were members of groups that, you know, had a rough time. So it's important to let as many folks in as possible. During my term, most of what I thought was really important was helping all the writers, people who needed to have help dealing with publishers who were not treating them right, people who were so poor after a career of writing but didn't have any money coming in, couldn't afford their membership, needed help with health problems, which are in the US is a big expense. And so ultimately those things are going to help the folks who are the least, I say the least in the group, you know, the people who need the most help. And that, to me, was the most important part of being Secretary of SIFL, was being able to help those folks.
One of the things that happened during the pandemic is we all got a lot more used to Zoom and to video calls. And I saw convention after convention going virtual and bringing in people who had never had a chance to come to a convention because they couldn't afford the travel, they couldn't afford the hotel, they had a sick mother or children that they had to take care of. And so there was a big democratization then, and I really hope that continues.
Oh, me too.
Yeah.
Tenemos la suerte de que estéis aquí en España.
We are lucky to have you because you are teaching in a writing workshop with Unanuno. Very fortunate people, and I would like to know which kind of teaching you are using at these workshops. I don't know, the contents, the program of the workshops, how it is, and what are you doing exactly? I'm feeling very curious about it.
Making them work so hard. Actually, the Barcelona Book Festival is partially responsible for the workshop because I was here last year and fell in love with Spain and then came home to America and said wistfully, oh, I would love to run a writing workshop in Spain. And my very talented friend said, well, let's see what we can do. And yes, we are staying in Castellais in Ripoll. And we have 12 students, and they are producing a story every 5 days.
Every 5 days. We're working them hard.
And so the first teacher was Sarah Pinsker. She had them for 5 days. Anne just finished having them for 5 days. Tobias Bakel is working them hard, even right now. And then next week, I will teach for 5 days. So, yeah.
And basically what happens, so I think what you're asking is, what is that like? How do we teach the thing? They turn in stories. They all read each other's stories. The teacher reads the stories. And then we sit down and we look at the stories and say, this is what's working well with this story. This isn't working so well for me. This might be how you change it. And then the teacher might spend some time during the day talking about writing things or answering questions. I usually just answer questions. Sarah and Tobias are fabulous. They can get up there and just talk about amazing writing things. And I'm like, I have nothing to say. What do you want to know? Right? And so that's basically how that goes. It's a lot of work. The students are going to be very tired when they're finished.
Yeah.
Es un método similar.
Is it a similar method as the one used in the Clarence West SALA. You were a student of.
Clarion West is 6 weeks.
Yes.
And we are doing basically in half the amount of time. So yeah.
It's very similar. There are some little differences, mostly things that the students it wasn't me, it was Kat, asked the students, how do you want to run the critiques? Because critiques can be very painful, even when they're good, even when it can be difficult, because you've taken this story out of your heart, right? Mm-hmm. And then to have anybody even say, oh, this one word, I think it could be better, can make you just feel like, oh, why do they hate me? So we want to be careful that they take what they need to and don't come away hurt. And so that's the standard Clarion West critique style, but modified just a little bit.
Yeah. And next year, I think we're going to be a little less hard. We let people sleep every once in a while.
I give them a day off.
Next year, it is going to be in Spain also? Or?
Next year is going to be in the U.S. because we want to move locations each time so as to allow different people to come. I believe we're thinking about a location in New Mexico. So still in the U.S. But then the year after that, we're talking about the Barbados. So this is my excuse to spend the month of November outside the United States. Because I don't know if you know, there's a holiday called Thanksgiving, and all your family comes.
Yeah.
Es una idea buenísima, la verdad.
It's a great idea, right? Yes. When I have to be with my mother-in-law, I guess I will use this technique. Why not?
Para escribir.
Do you think that to write you have to have a gift? I guess that when teaching about this, I guess we can work and improve and working hardly, I don't know, with slashes or whatever, but we can improve. But do we need to have this writing gift, or at least this deep interest to become a writer?
Definitely being interested in becoming a writer is crucial. As far as being gifted, I know many people who are incredibly gifted writers that will not write. That is not enough. To be a writer, you must write. And that is all. And you get better at writing. I mean, this is the dirty secret of teaching writing, is we would have to actively give you bad advice to keep you from getting better. So
yes,
go play lots of World of Warcraft, watch a lot of movies.
And write. Talent is a real thing, but you don't need a talent for writing. It might make some things easier, but in the end, the talent that you need to write is the talent to be determined to do it no matter what. That's the talent you need to write. And I don't think you can teach that talent necessarily, but as long as you're determined to do it, you just write, and you write, and you write, and you look at writing that makes you happy, that you like, and try and see what it is that you like about it, and then try to imitate that. It's just like anything. You do, if you want to learn to play the piano, you play scales, right? You practice the piano. If you want to learn to write, you practice writing. Maybe someone with talent will get farther if they work.
Or faster.
Or maybe. Faster, but that doesn't matter, right? The only question is, will you get where you want to get? And that's a question of how much work you want to put into it. Don't let people tell you that some people are born to write and some aren't. It's some people want to write and do it, and some people would prefer to do other things. As Kat said, many people with great writing talent don't do the work and don't get as far as the people who you would think have very little talent but who have put in the work and the practice.
But here's the other thing. If any of you want to write because you think it's going to make you rich...
Oh, no.
No. That's why you have to love writing, because it is not a well-paying job, and it is a very discouraging job.
I'm going to tell the joke that I don't know will translate into Spanish,
dear.
Which is, how is a science fiction writer different from a large pizza?
I don't know. How is a science fiction writer different?
A pizza can feed a family of 4.
Bueno, creo que es el momento.
Well, we could be here talking for a long, long time, but I guess that some of our audience, someone has a question or observes for our guest. I can't see anything with these lights, but there is a hand raised over there.
So grateful for having you here. I love you both. And I'm so happy to see you here again, Kat. Yes. And I would love to ask you, what are your favorite parts of or moments of the writing process, and what are the most dreaded parts for you of the writing process?
I love starting a piece because you can do anything, and I hate, there's a point right about the 90% mark where you're like, oh crap, I've written myself into a lot of things I now have to write myself out of.
Yeah, I love the research to develop a piece and then beginning a work. For me, the terrible point is about 3/4 of the way through, where all of a sudden I go, this is really stupid and bad and it doesn't make any sense, and why am I even fooling myself to think that I am a writer? But I remember that Neil Gaiman once told a story about how he was writing Anansi Boys, and he got about 3/4 of the way through, and he called up his agent and he said, this is terrible. This book is not going to work. We have to pay the publisher back the advance. I'm really sorry. It's terrible, but this is just not a viable book. And the agent started laughing at him. And she said, Neil, you do this every time. Hang up the phone and finish the book.
And it's true. So many
Yeah.
writers, you hit this point. It's not the finished part. It is somewhere just before finished. And you're just like, I hate this book.
I can't do this, yeah. And so I figured if it was okay for Neil Gaiman, it was okay for me. And so that's a bad spot. I also don't like revisions. I love my editors that I've worked with so far have been fabulous, and they send me back editorial notes, and I kind of look at the file and I kind of poke it with a stick a few times, and then I let it sit for a day or two, and then I open it up and I go, what are they? Oh no! I have to change all these things, and eventually I just sit down and do it. But that's like my least favorite part of it all. Yeah.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Any more questions in the audience? Yes.
To Anne Leckie, I really love your books. I think, it will be not enough to say how much, but I wanted to ask if this kind of I found that some of your characters, like Breck, Sivarden, Tisarwat, they are kind of also uncool. They have some coolness parts, but like Ingray in Provenance is utterly uncool. Like Ena, it's actually uncool. They make a lot of bad choices, whatever, but then they do not through heroic actions, but perseverance, through insistence. They do alliances, and I think this is most valuable part of all your books. Actually, for me, was that the individual people matter, their choices, however uncool they are, however whatever. The true kind of collective, I don't know, alliances building and so on, they can change a lot. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask about this uncoolness, because it's for me really, when I was thinking about this, I think typically male writers, they're only able to write losers, or villains or something, but this kind of uncoolness, which is progressive and insisting, I think it's something very, very special. If it's intentional or...
It's absolutely intentional. Thank you very much. One of the things when I wrote Ingray was a lot of times, especially in science fiction, right? The hero is I'm strong and competent and I'm brave, and I'm not strong and competent and brave. When scary things happen, I want to sit down and cry, and I'm like, we need to see more people like me on the page, right? I don't always feel like I'm in charge of things, but I also think that everybody's choices matter. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to put that on the page. And I'm glad you like that. I know some readers have picked that up and go, I can't stand Ingrid. She's a loser. She just cries all the time. And I'm like, well, okay, the book's not for you then. That's all right, you know. But I did that on purpose very definitely. And N.A. is another character who's not quite as frightened of life as Ingrid is, but definitely has some of the same things, because I wanted to be like, ordinary people are heroes. Ordinary people can be heroes. And I wanted to say that very explicitly.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Sí, aquí.
Any more questions? Yes? Yes, hello? Hello? Yeah, just there on your left. To your left. A year ago, it was a subject that was present in that fiction, but it was artificial intelligence after ChatGPT, arouse and all that. And this has generated some fears. Can we write about AI the same, I mean, surrounded by all these ways of writing, or how do artificial intelligences appear in fictions? Can we have another view, yes, can we be more optimistic maybe?
Can be more optimistic. I think we need to remember that artificial intelligences are things that are created and have the same nuances and feelings and prejudices as the creators. I mean, we need to not make the mistake of thinking that an artificial intelligence is a thing of science and will always be right. It is a tool. Artificial intelligence is a tool like any other tool.
And I would like to point out that ChatGPT is not artificial intelligence. People call it artificial intelligence all the time, but it is not. It is a glorified autocomplete.
It is the illusion.
It's the illusion of artificial intelligence, but the more you talk to it, the more plain it is that it's not intelligence. And I think a mistake that a lot of people are making right now is treating ChatGPT like it's actually artificial intelligence, because it isn't. A lot of times in science fiction, we write about artificial intelligence as though it's an existential threat to humanity. I think those stories are more about the kinds of people we are afraid of than they are about actual artificial intelligence. And I think it's worth thinking about what it is we're assuming when we assume that artificial intelligence is going to be way smarter than us and take us over. You know, that we mean them to be our slaves, but actually they're going to rise up and kill us all. Maybe think about parallels in the real world that perhaps that story is actually about. I think that it's important to think about these things, because as we get, if it's possible, as we get closer to an actual artificial intelligence, the stories we tell about that will inform how we treat it.
And how it
develops. So it's important to keep that apart. But please, ChatGPT is not artificial intelligence.
Pues se nos agota el tiempo, podríamos...
Well, we are running out of time. We could spend much more time talking. Yes, a very last question.
Aquí.
Yeah.
So based off of the title of the panel, I was just curious, do you have any words for any activists?
Yes.
Keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
Don't stop.
Well, and tell stories of hope. Tell stories of people working together. Tell stories of found family. Tell the stories, not just tell the stories that inspire people, but also provide the stories that people can take refuge in from the storm every once in a while.
Tell the stories of the world you want to see.
Yeah.
You don't have to, but if you're sitting down and saying, I'm writing as an activist act, one of those things can be to make a story about where you want to end up, because the stories tell us where we're going. The stories tell us how we see the world around us, and it's hard to imagine something that hasn't been in a story.
Yeah.
And so if you want to lay the groundwork for something that doesn't exist yet, tell a story about it.
Yeah.
Bueno, ya sí, me tenéis que perdonar, pero es que ya...
Yes, you will forgive me, but we will be too much ahead of schedule. Hope you enjoyed this talk with two great authors who will be signing outside. They will be signing their books, sorry. And remember that there are other worlds, but they are all in the 42. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.